these kinds of groups. And the more we can make them our allies as opposed to our opponents, I think the better off we'll be doing both for the patients, but also for ourselves as well, too. I mentioned a few other issues up here, too, as well. Basically, sort of the expanded communication network, iPhones, I mean, that's a simple example, but there are many other things that in terms of like all this enormous infrastructure development that's sort of really in communications and technology that can be used to actually help streamline the study and also enhance things like enrollment and so forth. And finally, advertising, which is sort of doesn't totally fit into the space up here, but it's a way of reaching out directly to patients. A few years ago, that would have been anathema. I mean, the idea about actually advertising a study on TV, no less, actually to patients, is actually still illegal in many countries. But in the US, you can do it. It needs to be reviewed by IRBs and regulatory authorities. But if you do it appropriately and cautiously and truthfully, it is a way of broadening your ability to talk to patients directly from the sponsor and tell them about your study and so forth, or at least tell them to contact you about your study, where they can then be sort of, coached about whether the study is appropriate for them or not. And that's really about it. I think hopefully I've impressed you with a few key themes here that align, I think, in a broad sense with the prior speakers. Clinical trial design is really central to a successful drug and biologic development. It's a pretty complicated process, and it's dynamic and shifting. And I think the bar that we have to hop over is getting only higher and higher for appropriate reasons, I think, in many cases, but it's a challenge for us. And basically, one way out of this potential trap that it looks like we could be sort of getting ourselves into is by careful design in terms of thinking about balancing sort of the high science and the operational pragmatism and the fact that you're after a regulatory goal for your studies in terms of like proving to regulatory authorities and patients that your drug actually works and is appropriate for them. And with that, I'll stop. I guess it's a panel discussion at this stage.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
You want to come down and take a seat? Thank you very much. And I think, what do we need to do here? Now we're going to have some time for any questions that you might have for each of the speakers. Perhaps while you're just gathering your thoughts, I'd like to just start off by asking you both a question, which has been bothering me for some time, and that is what you truly feel about outcome studies. I know, Peter, you said you're starting a 27,000 patient.
Not started. We're getting close to finish.
Oh, finishing, okay. 27,000 patient study that you're completing, so I hope you feel good about them. But I've been a little bit concerned over the last decade of some of the outcome studies, whether they've really done or given us any benefit in terms of our drug development, or whether they're just being done, like you pointed out quite correctly, for regulatory purposes, and that in many cases, if they to some extent fail, and we can discuss how they fail, whether they're really hurting us in terms of what we learn about drugs.
So it's a huge question, and I won't give it full justice, but I will say that I think there is value. I mean, the regulators, I think, have a point in arguing that surrogate endpoints often have been proven to be, despite the best biology in the world and the best thinking in the world, have often proven to be non-predictive, and in fact often sort of counterpredictive of the actual benefits to patients. So I think in many cases, it is appropriate to consider, an outcome study, whether they all have to be as big as, the one I alluded to. Certainly our statisticians would argue that it does, is, I think, a good question. And maybe another question, another way of thinking about your question is what research led up to the big outcome study? Obviously, you certainly want to make sure that before you pull the trigger on something as large as that, which however elegantly you design it is going to be inherently very expensive. What sorts of research you did with surrogate endpoints, lipid levels, LDL levels, glucose levels, what have you, to lead you to give you the confidence to say that actually we should do such a study, or whether to say, okay, look, this is just not something where we have that confidence. So I don't think that's a perfect answer to your question, but I think we're stuck with them because there have been enough times where we haven't done big outcome studies and they've been done later on after something was approved based on surrogate endpoints, where actually, in fact, the surrogate endpoints proved not to be very predictive of ultimate benefit to the patients. But I think we're somewhat going to have to be doing many studies like that for many of our areas. Now, in oncology, I think, I mean, it depends on the disease indication. I mean, for other types of diseases, actually very small studies, rather short studies will get you to exactly what you need right away. But in other areas where the patients have, will live longer, even if they're sick and have high LDL levels or whatever, you really sort of need to sort of see whether, in fact, you're actually saving lives.
Well, look, before you give your comments, I mean, one of the things that concerns me, though, is that I don't know that we can afford to do outcome studies for long enough to really get a true answer from the study. Because the low-hanging fruit that you both mentioned are such good drugs that people just don't die as quickly, and I mean that in a nice way, as they used to 30 years ago in these outcome studies. Now you have to go for 10 or 15 years in order to get the number of events that you want, or you have to take such sick patients that they may not be representative of the population. But anyway, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Well, it's a difficult topic. So outcome studies, in my view, simply there's a risk that they claim that they have found something, and we still don't know if we would have done another outcome study the same size, whether we would have got the same outcome.
Yeah, that's right.
So it's, for me, it is in a sense, it is a dead end. So the famous women's health study that found with the estrogens.
Mm-hmm.
There was one study done, change of practice all over the world. So if you talk to physicians, gynecologists, they say, well, what matters is the individual patient. One woman may be at risk, for the other woman it might be very beneficial. So the issue I have in the general with this very big study is that we are chasing the average patient. So we're looking at the end, when everything is said and done, we are getting the average value out there, comparing it to another group, and then say, okay, it worked, but it didn't work. And we are completely ignoring the fact that we had maybe many other patients who benefited from it. So I think and then there's another thing which I want to bring up here. So outcome studies are based of course, on statistics, and everybody assumes that randomized controlled trials is standard Fisher statistics. That's the way you do it. That's the best science. But it's very interesting when you read the book by Nate Silver, The Signal and the Noise. And I have spoken to quite a few statisticians who are Bayesian statisticians, who simply say the current statistics we are doing is a Fisher statistic, it is an accident of scientific history, but that's a p-value of 5%. It's treated as if it would be the number pi. It is artificial. And Nate Silver, he even recommends in his book, The Signal and the Noise, that we should stop teaching the Fisher statistics at graduate schools. We should throw it out. So coming back to your question, so the outcome studies, what is the basis of the outcome study? Why do we need so many patients? Because it applies the Fisher statistics, which is becoming more and more questionable. So that's my personal view, and I'm leading the statistics department. I am my head of statistics are very often very philosophical questions, but hey, we're beginning to come closer.
All right, questions for the speakers? Yeah.
So thank you for all your presentation, really it was excellent. So I have a question actually on the adaptive clinical design.
Oh boy, I'm not a statistician.
And you brought it up actually, so I was just curious to know your opinion as well as your colleagues here. Do you foresee that adaptive clinical design could be applied to all therapeutic area, or perhaps it's better for like orphan diseases or maybe devices? Because I'm struggling, like in cardiology, where you have these very huge trials. I mean, how could you make it work? So I'd like to hear.
Well, so I think the complexity of like biomedical research is just hard to ever use the word all, because inevitably there's some therapeutic area, or you mentioned devices and diagnostics, those are somewhat different spaces actually than medical development. So I won't say, I can't say all. I think it's a way that you should, or a methodology, just like any of the tools that we talked about, that should be considered. So there's no cookbook for clinical research. Here, the bullets I put up there might lead you to think that. And every sort of program and product and therapeutic area is its own area. It's just a scientific, or it's a statistical way of thinking that may allow, in some circumstances, you to be more frugal or efficient about, sort of designing your program. No, I would not say that necessarily it could work in every circumstance.
Yes, sir.
I'm a little bit.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I'm a little bit on the fence with adaptive using studies. So I had I put together a working group in my department of a number of very smart statisticians, and I asked them, give me an answer similar to your question. Where can we apply it? Can we apply it everywhere? And they came back after almost a year and told me it's still very difficult. So by and large, what you can say that for the study has to be long enough to justify adaptive design, because if you think about all the logistics, so while you do your analysis, you cannot turn things on a dime. So in more long-term studies, let me say, where you have 6+ months treatment in any therapeutic area, I think you should consider adaptive designs, and especially within adaptive design, so looking at the simpler models, which is testing for utility, which is or sample size re-estimation. I think these are pretty safe bets. So in large studies, you need to make sure that you're not underpowering your study, and also if the study has no chance to be successful, save your money and stop it.
I'll say that in the last few years, we've been taught, when studies start, you talk about adaptive design, probably a 10 or so, and it's much more complicated than anyone envisages, as I think they've been fighting. Of that 10, maybe one, we ultimately did an adaptive design, but there's some work to still be done. Other questions?
Can you tell me what either the FDA or the IRBs think of the proof of concept studies compared to the traditional methods? In other words,
Actually, I think we should ask our moderator that question.
are there ethical? You're right. Are there ethical issues, about approving those studies?
Yeah, I think that the FDA actually is quite comfortable with them, provided that there's not a safety issue that they're concerned about. In the discussions I've had with them, the feeling is that when we go into these early phase studies, we're looking for efficacy, safety, pharmacokinetics, and why would you not get the same sort of safety, and perhaps even more so, in patients who have the underlying illness than you would get in a normal volunteer? I think if originally we thought for normal volunteers, if you get unexpected side effects, can actually handle them much better. But I think they're feeling that you can still get a decent safety picture from patients who have the illness, as well as efficacy signal, which clearly in a world that we have to look at how we can diminish costs in drug development in order to get drugs out to the market. They seem to be fine with that. And of course you can get the same sorts of pharmacokinetic, bioavailability, excretion data in those patients as you can get in normal volunteers. Where it becomes a little bit more complicated though is in patients who are really sick. So recently we were asked to do a study on acute pancreatitis, for example. And now you're dealing with a group of patients who are really ill, and to be messing around or fiddling around with drugs that you're not quite sure of the dose, you're not quite sure of the efficacy, in patients that sick they're not that comfortable with. So it's probably going to be a bit of a mixed bag in terms of who they'll allow us to study.
Although isn't it the case that actually your PK/PD, your pharmacokinetics and so on, might actually be more appropriate in some patient populations? In fact, what you get in a normal simply wouldn't be as relevant.
Absolutely right, yeah, that's exactly right. Because there are some, for example, in heart failure patients, where you might get some impact on the absorption. That's very different to what we might see in normal volunteers, so you're absolutely correct. Yeah. Yeah.
So I had a question about concerning the reproducibility crisis. And one of the things that we've seen to try and remedy this is there are some journals now insisting that, as well as the summary paper, scientists also submit their entire data sets. Do you think this is something that's going to actually help, and should funders like the NIH mandate that people they fund share all of the data they produce. Well, that's an easy one.
Well, the question is what you mean by the full data set. So including all the lab books, all the other measurements, all the records and reports, because the data alone doesn't help so much, because you don't know how the data was collected. And when they submit the whole data, let me say in Excel format, you don't know whether the lines have been removed or left out. So ultimately you still have to trust that the data was collected adequately, but this is where my point is. I would make sure that the institution or the research lab, that they have a quality management system in place, that they have a check and balances in their own organization. Then I don't need to have the data set, because I can assume that if everything works, that the quality manager check the data, that there was adequate review of the data, and so on and so on. I think it shows how desperate the situation is.
If I can ask a follow-up question of that, actually. So in the area of sponsored research, where we are sort of scrutinized by regulators, and they do in fact visit our sites, do you feel we're as vulnerable to reproducibility problems as in sort of more basic research, where, for example, there are laboratory books that may be lost or archived?
No, absolutely not. Absolutely not. I think sponsored clinical research is in a much, much better place than the so-called unregulated research, where scientists, they don't want to be regulated, but whatever sounds like good GXP, they run away from it as if well, could be quite underplayed here. Thank you.
Yeah.
Part of the problem about reproducibility is also that there needs to be a funding mechanism for academic research to actually put all those people into place in university for oversight. And that may not be so easy unless NIH would fund that as an independent avenue for overhead, or at least figure out a way to do it.
Could you repeat the question for the camera? I couldn't get that.
Yeah, the question was whether we have enough funding really to put this oversight in place that would be necessary for this type of quality research, if I understand correctly.
That's correct.
Well, I would then ask, what is the purpose of research? So, I know it is an issue to find the resources. However, is there any justification to do research that produces noise? So I rather do less research and put the people in place that make sure that what we do has high quality. I would say in this case, there's no shortage of biomedical research publications. So we can safely cut it back by 80%. And if you have, instead of the 80% less publications, but the 20% publications we have are then high quality in the publication, we will be much better off.
Yeah.
Is there any data on the reproducibility of studies from academic institutions versus like industry-sponsored research? Do you know if there is any difference?
Can you repeat the question?
Is there any data on the reproducibility in academic institutions versus sponsored studies?
Well, sponsored studies are usually the clinical research studies, and they are done following the FDA guidelines. They are being monitored, they are being inspected. And we know that in clinical research, this is why the FDA asks for at least 2 confirmatory studies, because they know that one study doesn't prove that the drug works. So we have there also a reproducibility issue. However, as pointed out in the literature sources I named in my presentation, in non-regulated research, the situation is really, really bad. And this is data there, all over the place. So I can only encourage you, read the chapter, Forensic Bioinformatics in this Handbook of Oncology Statistics. You can find it, I think you can find it on the internet. It is so insightful. And there you see data after data after data that prove that the situation is pretty bleak.
In context of all those issues of productivity and the number of drugs, and also the arena of medical research is no more Europe or US, are there any efforts to address an international platform where we can align the interest of industry, IP, and academia, and sort of a real open innovation platform? Are there any efforts that's been done?
So is your question about reproducibility, or is it about sort of industry, government alignment and to promote innovation? I want to make sure we're answering the right question.
The second one, so that we don't reproduce and also reduce the noise and somehow address.
That's a huge question, so I'll take a small slice of it and so forth, and then defer to my colleagues up here to sort of tackle other pieces of it. I mean, I think the answer is, implicit in our discussions up here is there is somewhat of a partnership already between regulators, that is the government, who hopefully somewhat represent their population.